Morning, everybody. You know, driving over here, I wanted somebody to get me a road as a service. In Bangalore, I think that's what you desperately need. Uh, but anyway, I just want to actually go back. Harshit mentioned that I started something about business outcomes. It was actually roughly around 2002. And I must tell you that it was, and I'll try and talk to you about how that whole thing started. Very early, actually in 1998, if I start giving you anecdotes of 1998, you know how old I am, and if I start giving you anecdotes of 1990, then you know how old I am, etc., etc. But in 1998, there was actually a very interesting company called Choreo. Anybody heard of Choreo? Well, a couple of people, I'm glad. They were the first company which came out with a model which was called Application Service Provisioning. ASPs, they were called in those days. So an ASP was a fairly simple concept. Basically what they did was they put on a PeopleSoft instance on their server, and then they went to a number of mid-sized small companies and said that you don't need to invest in PeopleSoft, we'll just run the PeopleSoft instance for you, and you just pay us basically based on number of users that you have. So today's concepts of, whatever we are talking about, SaaS and so on and so forth, was born at that time, except now the technologies just make it dramatically more easy to do those kinds of things than Choreo did. Choreo's time to revenue from a customer, because the customer started paying once he could do something, used to be measured as 92 or 93 days. Now with the SaaS products, you can probably do time to revenue of less than 15 days, right? So that's how technology has morphed, and that's how things have changed, and so on and so forth. So, when I looked at the Choreo model, I actually thought it's an interesting model, and I don't know if you guys know what happened. IBM bought the company and killed it because they didn't like that kind of competition. They didn't like that kind of innovation. It was a definite threat to all of the guys who were selling licensed software and so on and so forth. So the model just got killed. But having said that, it was around that time that I took a look at it and said, we should be able to offer something more. One of the biggest challenges for many of us in this Indian industry who have worked on services companies is, what is the holy grail, right? We just keep looking for that holy grail, and in my mind, the holy grail for the Indian IT services company is the ability to deliver services in some way through a shared services platform while billing on an outcomes model, which means that your pricing is not linked to the number of people that you're doing, and your operating model is a shared services model. So basically your cost structure is largely through technology and infrastructure and stays relatively low. So that's really the grail that I was trying to pull off. So we started this whole stuff in 2002, and I want to just tell you what were the big ticket changes in mindset that happened, and that will give you an insight into how complex this journey is in some cases, and then I'll come and bring it back to the current Fortune 500 kind of where I'm seeing the adoption happening. But in 2002 when I started, I said, I'm going to do the entire business process of application through funding of a loan through this model. So in those days, a mortgage in the US was terribly expensive. It used to cost roughly about $2,300, $2,400 to process a loan. It was very manual. And I said, this is great. I can just take a look at this business process. An application comes in, there are multiple steps. So what I did was I built a workflow-based solution. In those days, built a portal, so exposed stuff to the web and so on and so forth. And I was able to reduce the cost of delivery of that mortgage to about $1,000 for the banks. And my model was very simple. It's $1,000 per funded loan. So you get value, I get value. You don't get value, I don't get value. It was the closest thing to partnership compared to what anybody talks about, because in general, it's very difficult to do a partnership in any other model, because I actually always want more and the customer always wants less. This is the only way, unless you can align with the business outcomes model, it's very difficult to actually talk about a partnership, right? The challenge is always identifying a business outcome which everybody is aligned with and that you have significant influence over. So one of the interesting behavioral changes that we noticed was, the first thing is we were hiring people from the Indian industry, and they actually wanted to know how many people they were going to manage, how many people they were going to manage. And I used to tell them, actually I don't want you to manage anybody. I just wanted to build cool technology to do this stuff in a completely automated manner. And there were social implications, we struggled with it initially with a lot of people coming and telling us, but if I'm a manager and somebody tells me, if somebody asks me and I say I don't have anybody to manage, the girl won't come and marry me, and it was those kinds of social implications, right? My parents are asking, how big is your team? And I can't say 2 people or 1 person building cool technology, and it was quite early in those days. We managed through all of those. We actually convinced them about change. We convinced people about how to automate and reduce the number of people and how they could actually get an incentive and a better performance and a throughput. So the incentives all had to be changed, not in terms of getting productivity out of 50 people, but actually trying to figure out how you can not have 50 people, but have 5 people doing a job, and so on and so forth. So we went through that big cultural transformation in the company. But I think the biggest aha moment for me in how powerful this model was and how this concept of anything as a service is really going to take on, and if you align with the business outcomes, was we used to have something called effectively what is called a pull-through rate. A pull-through rate is something which is how many people have I approved a loan for who actually take a loan from me. So that means, typically what happens in the US is a broker goes out and he applies to 2 or 3 banks for a loan for you. And maybe both the banks or 3 banks, all of them actually came back and approved a loan. So you as a customer now, borrower, is actually going to select one particular bank. And that's called a pull-through rate. And that pull-through rate was about 38 or 40% for most of the banks that we were doing this work for. And what happened was that our guys turned around and said, we think we can change this. They applied some analytics. The customer always used to believe it was based on product design, that the pull-through rate can't change because it was a product design feature. We actually proved that it was we didn't actually prove to anybody, we just proved to ourselves that it was actually based on turnaround time. And we produced a fast track kind of a process, and we were able to do it, and the pull-through rate went up to 60%. Now just look at the value difference. We were doing all of the work anyway for 100 loans. Earlier we were getting paid for 40. Now we're getting paid for 60. The bank was doing work for 100 loans. Earlier they were getting value out of 40, and now they were getting value of 60. And that's what that whole partnership model works. That's how the whole partnership model started evolving. And that's why this concept of, in my mind, in that particular case, we were essentially offering business process as a service, or the mortgage process entirely as a service, using technology, all the underlying stacks. Struggled through it, and in 2008, actually, when the whole mortgage crisis happened, that particular part of the business just collapsed. But there were 3 or 4 things that happened much later which continued to make the movement very much better. The first, the cloud. So when we started in 2002, there wasn't really a cloud. It was just our own small data center, or we were co-locating it in a data center, etc., which is very different from the way the clouds are optimized for performance today. So that was, and for security and so on and so forth. So the moment the clouds came, it became a lot more easier. And today, actually, with the number of microservices which are available on 3 big cloud platforms that I can think of, Google, Microsoft, and Amazon, who clearly are going to be the winners in this game. I mean, there isn't even a doubt about it in my mind, at least, that these 3 are going to end up as the big winners in this game. And having visited each of these companies and gone through their plans and what their strategies are, it's actually quite fascinating how different companies, while they're all talking about 60–70% of the same thing, there is 20-30% difference in evolution in terms of what they're thinking. Google, of course, continues, down its mission around, I want to make the world's data available to everybody as a service effectively, right? They want to be able to organize the world's data and present it in some way or the other. So if you look at the Google Cloud, the number of access to public data sources that you have and so on and so forth is actually quite phenomenal. So from an enterprise perspective, if you need to incorporate a whole bunch of public data sources into your solutions, it does potentially make sense to do that work on a Google Cloud versus if you were to do very fast applications processing or something like that, it probably does make sense to do it on an Amazon cloud, etc., etc. So, those clouds I think are evolving in slightly different ways and they're all investing in different places. And today, genuinely, I think everything is starting to move as a service. I'm consulting with a couple of banks and insurance companies, and these are banks and insurance companies who probably 5 years ago would have said, we're sorry, we're just not going to go to the cloud. I actually had an argument with the CIO of Goldman Sachs a few years ago when he said, we'll never go to the cloud. I said, you're already on the cloud. You're 30-35% already on the cloud. He said, what do you mean? No, we'll never put any of our applications. Well, you got Office on the cloud. You got Workday, which is effectively on the cloud. So you go start listing out a whole bunch of software which they're already using in their company, and it's Salesforce, of course, which is already on the cloud. And then slowly, I think, realization started dawning on many of these people that, it's something which really you can't do much about. And the first big bank which made a commitment to be 100% on the public cloud was Capital One. And they just finished their public cloud journey. So they're the first bank which is 100% on public cloud. And that has put significant pressure on all of the other banks to effectively start following suit. So if you look today, you're talking about anything as a service. Yes, indeed, it is anything as a service. And the latest of the Silicon Valley companies which, I was looking at was a fascinating company which offers Windows as a service now. So you don't need effectively any specific kind of desktop. You can have any device you want and you're just getting Windows as a service from the cloud. Just imagine the ease in terms of managing patches, imagine the ease in terms of management of your desktop and so on and so forth environment. It's just a completely different game now. Everything is starting to move as a service. From a Fortune 500 perspective, of course, this is fantastic news. Everything is available on a consumption model. And regardless of which way you fall on the debate of CapEx versus OpEx, the reality is that all Fortune 500 is slowly adopting more and more of SaaSes. Today, the footprint of SaaS versus licensed product in an average on Fortune 500 is over 50%. So more than 50% of my applications are in some sense on a consumption-based model already. And probably in the next 3 years, it will be probably close to 80 or 90%, which will be there. From a SaaS provider, it's actually quite fantastic. SaaS companies get valuations probably of 8 to 10 times revenue. License providers get valuations of 3-4 times revenue. So it's a no-brainer today if I want to build a software, how I want to architect it, how I want to change it, etc. Who are the guys who are going to get whacked in this? The people who are going to get whacked in this are really the IT service providers. This massive, big industry that we have built in India, right? Because more and more of the value extraction is happening through the cloud players. More and more of the value extraction is happening through SaaS providers. And because of this, our role as a services company, if you run services companies, the role is going to switch to more an orchestration player, which doesn't need tens of thousands of people. So this is the technology discontinuity in my mind that can flip and create millstones around assets, right? So if you look at all great companies have been born because of technology discontinuities or some discontinuities. So if you look at what happened in the late 80s, a lot of companies came into being because they said IBM, CSC, EDS, those guys are all the mainframe guys. You know, we'll just do client server work, we'll do fantastic client server work, etc., etc. Early 90s, we brought about the operating model discontinuity. And that was, we'll just do faster, cheaper, better, we'll just do it from India. Right? So we'll do faster, cheaper, better. Again, in the mid-90s, you had the internet services kind of companies, you know, companies like the Sapiens and the Cambridges and all that stuff who came in and said, you know, all these guys are the old guys, we know how to build internet-related software, we know how to build software which can talk to thousands of millions of people and all of that kind of stuff, always on software, that kind of stuff, and so on and so forth. So if you go down that path, here's the opportunity in my mind to start thinking very differently about what a services company should do. Today, the advantage of a platform that Google, Microsoft, and Amazon offers is really that you can take any kind of microservice and actually have it available to somebody. So I believe that I can build something really cool because I know that in disability, fraud, in insurance, I have some specific expertise. To convert that to a service which is usable by a Fortune 500 company today is actually relatively easy because I can put together so many microservices available on these platforms and actually make my service a full service without having to build and write a whole lot of code. And that's the magic, you know. The whole principle was that when internet came, we would be able to all put out our stories, whatever we wanted, we could publish anything, we could broadcast anything, you know, any person with a cell phone today is actually a broadcaster and a producer of a movie, you know, and so on and so forth. Here actually, if you have a good idea, to produce a software or to produce a microservice which a Fortune 500 company can use comfortably is relatively little effort in today's day and age. And therefore, if you start looking at all of the trends that are happening in the marketplace, projects becoming much smaller, microservices becoming more and more prevalent, interconnectedness of microservices through really good, really high quality middleware platforms in today's world, you know, some of the MuleSofts and so on and so forth that you probably have heard of and worked on, just makes life a lot simpler. You know, many of us have gone through enterprise architecture diagrams of many companies, and I must confess that I was actually fascinated to see two enterprise architectures that I loved, completely different from anybody else. One was Google's and one was Amazon's. And while we see in almost all cases a whole bunch of lines going across and connecting, you know, this with that, that with this, etc., etc., the Google and Amazon architectures were just a listing. The Amazon architecture was just a listing of 5,500 microservices because all of them talk to each other. That's how fascinating life has started to change. And that's how you and I can therefore build anything sitting on top of these 5,500 microservices potentially and offer anything else as a service. So tomorrow I can offer fraud as a service, I can offer AML as a service, I can offer KYC as a service, I can pretty much offer anything you want as a service. And if you look at what's happening, even the famous, all the big outcomes model, the digital world has started to lead to creation of more and more business outcomes model. So he spoke about GE, and you know, for many of you who know GE Digital had built a software called Predix. And GE was actually using Predix to bid for large outcomes-based projects from very many companies. So what would they do? They would turn around and go to a train operator and they would say that we are just going to optimize your fuel consumption and we just want a percentage of the savings on the fuel that you have. And they would put all of this big data together into their model, which is what is the terrain, what's the contour of the, what's the angle of the inclination, and so on and so forth. And they would start feeding in data as to what the acceleration and what the deceleration should be for the locomotive. And that was going to save enough fuel that they would be able to figure out how to actually make significant money of it. They would go to a power plant, put a bunch of these IoT devices and put a bunch of all of this stuff, and they would figure out how to make the power plant more efficient, and they would take a percentage of that efficiency increase. So effectively now, what you're actually saying, almost to the tune that it's becoming profitability as a service. I mean, just think about how fascinating that is. These companies are going to other companies and saying, I'm going to actually change your profit and I'm giving you effectively profitability as a service. I'm making all of the investments. I'm making all of the, whether it's infrastructure, and they don't have to make the infrastructure investments because Amazon, Microsoft, and Google have actually done it for the whole world. I'm just going to put some cool thoughts, but I'm offering you profitability as a service, and I'll take a percentage of that profitability as a service. So it is actually starting to become a fascinating world. And why couldn't we do this 20 years ago? 20 years ago, we couldn't do this, although people used to talk about all kinds of object and object-oriented, because that's actually now a reality. We couldn't do it because you needed tons of processing power for various things. You actually now have the cloud to do this processing power. I had a, I saw in your thing, I had a fascinating conversation with a guy who was running a project for Amazon, which he couldn't do, by the way. It was to have a 20-minute free-flowing conversation with Alexa. That was his project, right? You can go, no context, no nothing. I can just walk into Alexa and say, hey Alexa, this. I can talk about the sports, I can talk about politics, I can jump from Japanese politics to baseball in the US, I can jump from baseball in the US to Australian cricket or whatever it is, right? So that he couldn't do. And the reason why he couldn't do it was because, believe it or not, there wasn't enough computing power. Because the moment you give 5 words, the computing power is X. You make it 25 words, it goes exponentially up. And you make it 50 or 100 words, you're running out of computing power now to be able to do it. And quantum computing is coming, hopefully, in a couple of years as a service. Stable quantum computing will be coming as a service, which will allow you to be able to do anything pretty much in terms of processing that you want. At least that's what we can imagine today. I mean, who knows, how our imagination is going to change in the next couple of years and over the course of the time. And of course, the big advantage is that once quantum computing is here, hopefully, at least in my generation, singularity will be here. So now you're actually talking about, can I offer smartness as a service? We talked about offering profitability as a service for corporations. Now can I offer individual smartness as a service if singularity is here at some portion of time, right? So, it's a fascinating world. I mean, I actually think you should fasten your seatbelts because for the next 10 years, you're going to have the complete ride of your life if you're anyway connected to technology. It's just a fascinating time. And I always used to say this, one of my favorite technology anecdotes or jokes has always been that 20 business executives were actually told one dinner time, come on tomorrow morning, we're going to take you on a test flight of a complete software controlled plane, fly by wire, no humans involved. And all these 20 business executives, whoa, super, let's go and all that. So they all came in bright and early at 8 a.m. the next morning. And privately, once they had come in, each one of those business executives was taken aside and they were told, your company's software operations wrote the software for this plane. So what do you think happened? 19 executives backed out, some said, I haven't had breakfast yet, sorry, appointment with the wife, and etc., etc. And the 20th got into the plane, kicked off his shoes, pushed his seat back, asked for a drink, and said there isn't any problem because if my company's software operations wrote the software, it will never get off the ground. So those were the days, 20 years ago when we had absolutely no faith in software. And today, how the world has changed, our life is very much dominated by software, right? Google can probably give you much better directions going anywhere to anywhere in Bangalore than any human being can. That's actually how fascinating life has become, right? And it has created all of these services which are available in effect as a service to us, has created complete changes. The 1-year program that the London taxi cab driver had to do before he became a black taxi operator is all gone because somebody with a small cell phone knows all the roads in London and all of the stuff, right? I mean, it has changed completely various business models. So I'm just thinking few years profitably as a service for corporations, a few more years, intelligence as a service or smartness as a service for human beings. Singularity is coming. Thank you. Happy to take any questions if you want. Yes. Some mic's coming from just behind you.
So you mentioned a couple of times that the singularity is coming.
Yes.
Isn't profitability now irrelevant once the singularity is upon us?
I mean, I don't think profitability for corporations will ever be irrelevant. You still have to figure out how to do it. I don't know. I haven't looked that far into the future, to be honest. Why would profitability be irrelevant? I think the question that you may have to answer is a slightly different question in today's technology. It will be like Bhishma, the question that Bhishma had to answer. When would you like to die? Because with today's gene therapy, with today's nanotechnology, with your bionic arm, bionic leg, you can pretty much replace anything you want. So then the question becomes, what is death and what is consciousness? And it's fascinating that as we go further and further, we have to look for answers 3,000 years back in Hindu philosophy or Hindu mythology. That's what the answers will come from. But I don't know why you think that profitability will be irrelevant if singularity is down the corner.
So, we are looking at a post-scarcity world, and I think we're going to end up in a post-capitalism world at that point, because I think a singularity economy looks a lot more like a welfare economy. And in that kind of social and economic structure, I think companies will end up being less oriented towards profit and more oriented towards mindshare, more oriented towards impact that they're making.
It could be. And, the first thing that we need to do is just wait for quantum computing to be available quickly. 10 years, 12 years later, hopefully we will have some of these things, and you have 10 years, you have a decade to probably figure out some of these answers. But I want to just touch upon something that you said. You said it will become a welfare thing. I don't know if you read, in 2017, towards the end of 2017 or early 2018, Switzerland conducted a referendum to offer a flat wage to every Swiss citizen because they were concerned about the AI-based automation that was happening in the world, right? So they felt everything can be automated. It's starting to look like, today we are already in this phase of decision automation. That referendum failed for a variety of reasons. I think it just failed. But very interestingly, about 6 months after that, there was a village in Finland which passed a referendum like that because of this, thinking that because of automation and AI, there may not be very many things left to do, and to avoid crime, basically the idea was, can you just figure out how to pay everybody a flat amount? So the world is going to change very dramatically. And certainly if you have to start thinking about immortality and, to answer the question of when do you want to die, 55 or 60 looks quite young to retire, right? Looks, and as it is with life expectancy changing very dramatically, you talk about things as a service, with life expectancy changing very dramatically, the turn of the century, anyway it is estimated that the average life will be 145 years by the turn of this century. And that's up from 80, right? And I think there's some crazy statistic, I don't know exactly what it is, but it's something like 95% of the people who are over 85 are still alive or something like that. That shows you that how in the past nobody actually lived that long, and now more and more people are living much longer. And there are all kinds of paid forward services which are already starting, right? As a service, in a sense, I can actually go and help an aged person and it gets banked. So my years of helping or my months of helping get banked, and I can draw on it when I need that help, maybe when I'm 85 or 90 or whatever it is. So models are changing, and I think everything is changing in this world, and that's why I said it's just a fascinating time to be in the world. Yes?
Staying on the same context you talked about, Phaneesh, the average age of a person is growing, the world population is growing, the quantum computing is going to be reality for sure, may or may significantly result into a singularity. What the people of the world will do, what talent which needs to be cultivated in a country like India, which essentially will keep it ahead of the rest of the world?
That's the multi-billion-dollar question, I suppose. But I think, if you just start thinking about all of the things that can happen. I don't know if any of you have seen a fascinating TV series called Person of Interest. Was it ever shown here? It was. Just a few. It's a fascinating TV series. It actually talks about how do you give a computer an ethical behavioral mind, right? How do you teach a computer what's right and what's wrong? How do you teach a computer not to play the odds? Let's say, okay, I'll sacrifice these 10 lives for 500, or what, which is the normal mathematical model and so on and so forth. I actually do believe that there's still a lot of work. Luckily, all of these changes happen over a couple of decades, not over a couple of years. It doesn't happen overnight, it just happens over time, and because of that, I believe that we will all start figuring out and relearning and readjusting. I mean, already all of us use some kind of, I'm assuming almost all of us use some kind of AI products in our houses, whether it's a simple Roomba vacuum cleaner to, so that you don't have to do anything around it. It just figures out where all it has to vacuum and so on. To more sophisticated phones or something like that for voice recognition and those kinds of things. I just believe that we are all slowly evolving as individuals. And of course, the most fascinating statistic is if only 7% of a human brain is actually utilized today, I just believe that we have a lot more room to figure many of these things out. I don't believe anybody has the answers to those questions today. Yes?
Sir, referring to
that the Indian IT industry killed the automated code generators just by throwing bodies, and it was cheaper. And it survived that onslaught. But AI is probably more virulent form of automated code generators. And with the SaaS and everything going around, what can the IT services industry do to, to thrive again?
I think, you're absolutely right. Unfortunately, I remember being very much part of those sales stories. There was a product called IEF, which was from TI, which was an automated code generator. I remember having conversations with CIOs saying, we are contemplating buying IEF so that we don't have to do much programming work. And I would say, why would you do that? You put the fear, uncertainty, doubt. It's okay for simple menu-based screens, but for complex programming logic, it just needs human beings to do that complex programming logic. He said, really? Oh, yeah. And then, performance, and code generators are always an issue. We'll give you a performance tune. No, but, then, we'll need some 75 people. No, why 75? I'll give you 150 people, but it'll be very expensive. No, I'll do it from India for 25 bucks an hour, so don't worry about it, kind of stuff. So that was the way the model. But the reality is that for 20 years, when India clearly had the leadership in services, we brought no innovation to the system. That was the tragedy. And finally, somebody said, enough is enough. This has just gone way too far. And effectively, innovators started taking that control back. So from an Indian IT industry, I think the best idea is to start investing a little more in orchestration kind of capabilities rather than building programming kind of capabilities, and building bunches of microservices which can actually be used by more and more people, and figuring out how to do these orchestration and integration work. That, I think, will be a lot more of the future work. I mean, we keep saying that legacy systems are likely to go away, but I really, for the first time, I'm actually starting to believe that legacy systems are probably going to go away in the next many years. I mean, again, not overnight, but over time. I do believe that that's what's going to happen. So, change of skills, thinking very differently, and working very differently, I would say, is what. Thanks.
So, referring to the advancement that we are making in AI, and probably we'll be having a couple of decades or a little more than before we reach the singularity. And how do you see that we are putting a proper governance in terms of probably a better job or in terms of safety? When we think about singularity, how well we are in terms of governance?
I don't think we are there. And that's why I want you guys to watch that person of interest. I think it's a fascinating thing because it actually teaches this whole story. I mean, it talks about a world run by machines, and it talks about how you should create a good machine and how you can create bad machines and all of those kinds of things. I don't believe that there is. But I'll just ask you a simple question. If the government told you, we actually want to know what you're doing on a daily basis. We want to know what you're eating. We want to take pictures. We want you to take pictures of what you're eating and tell us what you're eating. We want to know what you're doing on a daily basis. You would have probably had a revolution on our hands. But the moment somebody says, it's free, do it if you want, everybody does it, right? And I believe that social opinion, and I believe that crowdsourced opinion will start deciding what is good and what is bad and what's right and what is wrong in the future. It's not going to be individual opinions. I actually do believe that the form of governance is going to move away from a few people to millions and billions of people. I mean, just think about all of the things which are already happening, right? If you look at a brand marketer used to, many years ago, used to thrive on information asymmetry. So he would build a brand saying, this is a really cool, fantastic, high quality product, and so on and so forth. Now you had no way of knowing whether the product worked well, didn't work, what were the problems, and so on and so forth. Today, if you want to buy a product, you have 5,000 reviews on that product right next to it. And that does wonders for the brand compared to whatever a brand marketer can do. It can do wonders well and it can do wonders badly also, right? So already brands are being formed by crowdsourced opinions rather than brand marketers. So the influence of brand marketers on their own brand has come down. And I do believe that that's what's going to happen in almost all spheres, that we are going to start getting people-based governance, which is true governance and so on and so forth. I think that's what's going to end up happening.
One question.
Yes.
Phaneesh, you spoke about profitability as a service.
Yes.
The question that comes to my mind is, how practical or feasible it is in terms of actually implementing it. And you quoted a couple of examples, iTops, and you also spoke about Predix. But when you really look back, my personal opinion is GE did not succeed to the extent that it probably thought it would, making the kind of investments that it did. Some of the experiences that we ourselves have gone through is when we try to offer something like this to our customers, the question in their minds is always, how much more money are you making? Why should I pay pay you for that profitability as a service? Why don't I just get that solution that you're implementing and I retain all the profits going forward? So I'll just pay, it's like work for hire rather than sharing of profits. Some of these are challenges that we are actually encountering. So what is the practicality or feasibility of such a service?
I think 3 or 4 things. One is, I do believe those are challenges, but I think they are challenges more because we don't reach the right person who will buy that service. So if you sell some of these services to a CIO, it's very unlikely that he will buy it. You have to move it to a business leader because they are more responsible for this stuff, and the CIO actually does feel threatened by some of this stuff. So, it gets killed right there. So I think the challenge that you're having potentially, because many of us have to end up dealing with procurement layers, CIO layers, and so on and so forth, I think that's really what ends up happening. Having said that, while I do agree with you that GE did not succeed as well as we would have liked it to succeed with that model, they actually never really went out and offered profitability as a service. They used to offer something else. And I'm just trying to extrapolate that theory that tomorrow it will be profitability as a service. Is this what I think is going to happen? I do believe it will happen. I think that you need different types of people talking to different types of people in those organizations. This is all generational thinking. You're absolutely right. A lot of us were born in the age where we always felt that, if a negotiation is done, if you win, I lose, and if I win, you lose, right? I mean, that's the whole thing. And now you're starting to see more and more models which are true win-win kind of models. So I believe that if you can truly deliver good intellectual capital, I believe that you will be able to move to those models. But if it is just services work, I think it's very difficult to do it in those models. Even if you want to do it in that model, I think it's very, but I believe that you have to have some intellectual capital encapsulated in some way for you to be able to do this thing in that model. Okay.
Last questions, we will be having a lunch session, coffee after this, where you can ask more questions. Last one question, anyone?
Nobody wants to go last, and nobody wants to go first. We're all middle of the road path, guys. Anyway, all the best, everybody. Have a great time. Thanks.